when it comes to then talking about the past, you're not going to be scientifically able to prove that. And that's what we need to admit. You can't prove scientifically the age of the Earth or the universe, bottom line.
But I don't think that religion has anything useful to teach us.
Your world just becomes fantastically complicated when you don't believe in evolution.
Mutations don't create new kind of creatures.
If you actually read any book by a biologist about evolution, it's hard to see how you could fail to be persuaded of it.
But to explain life without God, you've got to have enormous periods of time. So they only pick the methods that seem to indicate, well, maybe there has been a lot of time.
And tax dollars used for science education shouldn't be used to teach creationism as an alternative.
It's a story to try to explain things as if God hasn't done it. They find
creationism is not right.
flowers and plants in different rock layers, and they give them
the world
certain
is that
ages.
young,
They pick a dating method
created
that
that
supports their
quickly, and
beliefs.
that ancient dinosaurs are...
Good afternoon, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out. I'm the moderator today. I wear many different hats. My favorite title is dad, as husband, and also as the high school pastor here at Cornerstone Church. Yeah, that deserves some love, Our motto here is welcome home. We believe that we want you all, as we heard earlier, to have a community and have a place, and that's why we're doing Moment of Truth, a safe place, a safe space where everyone is welcome to dialogue, especially interreligious dialogue. Scriptural reasoning is growing rapidly within our society to discuss in a safe way in a world of tensions and discrimination where we reprove that, where we celebrate different hearts, different minds, academia, to discuss different topics. So we're doing that for the next 6 weeks. Welcome to week 1 as we launch this discussion between evolution and creationism. And so we have both sides with high honor to both. I really enjoyed having time with both of our speakers, Aaron Ra, and having a steak dinner with him last night in his company. And I look forward to keeping a relationship with him for years down the road. And also Mr. James Umber, who is speaking on behalf of creationism. And so we have some ground rules today to respect the amount of time, effort, that they've put into this discussion, into this reasoning. So we're going to ask that you would hold all applause off until after the discussion. And here's why. There's 6 total questions. They both have agreed on these questions and gave us these questions based on their beliefs. They will each have 3 minutes to answer the questions that we present to them. And so we're going to hold off all applause until afterwards and celebrate and respect mutual understanding and agreement on the topic that we have for today. We thank you for trusting us and for being a part of this, as we believe true openness involves remaining steadfast in one's deepest convictions, as we are about to see here today, clear and joyful in one's own identity, while at the same time being open to understanding those of the other party, and knowing that this dialogue will enrich both sides of the coin. We reprove any discrimination against people or any harassment of them on the basis of their race, color, condition in life, or religion here. Instead, we have deep recognition for commonality and consensus among both sides. And we believe that part of mutual hospitality is learning to disagree in courtesy and in truth. And each tradition, as well as each academic discipline, embraces complex practices of discussion and dispute. And so would you join with us as we have a safe dialogue and conversation as I invite our speakers out on the subject of evolution and creationism. Our time is limited, so I want to go ahead and begin our discussion today. First, I'd like to invite out Aaron Ra. Would you please give him a warm welcome? Yes, if you want.
I'm here at the How you do, everybody? Am I on?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, my name is Aaron Ra. I'm a regional director with American Atheists, author of Foundational Falsehoods of Creationism. I have some books with me if you'd like a signed copy. Also director of the Phylogeny Explorer project, which is something I'm enormously proud about. It's been a project we've been working on for a few years now, building the entire taxonomic tree of life in a navigable online encyclopedia. So hopefully we'll have that released to the public by the end of the year.
Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is a creationist and apologist, Mr. James Umber.
All right, well, so my background is in architecture, actually, and then now I'm working on my master's in apologetics, which is the evidence for Christianity. And so I've been doing presentations in the Valley, in and around the Valley, and you can check out our website. It's examined-life.org, Examined Life.
Excellent, thank you. Again, I would like to ask the audience to hold all your applause till the end of this discussion as we begin our discussion. Question 1, what scientific evidence do Darwinists claim best supports their theory?
Well, there's the fact that evolution happens, so we know it's real. I mean, you can't just say that anything is possible. I mean, before we can determine whether something is possible, there must be some precedent or parallel or verified phenomenon indicating such possibility exists. We don't have that for anything supernatural. But evolution is an inescapable fact of population genetics, and we know the mechanisms for it work. I'm not just talking about microevolution either. Macroevolution has exactly the same mechanisms. Microevolution is variation within species. Macroevolution is the same mechanisms, but variation between species, at or above the species level, where the parent gene pool is no longer restrictive. This has been observed and directly observed and documented dozens of times in lab and in the field. And I'm getting stunned and I'm on a time limit. Okay, the strongest evidence that we have that humans have evolved from apes is the fact that we are still apes right now, being members of the taxonomic superfamily Hominoidea. Diagnostic homologies in taxonomy were the oldest evidence of evolution long before Darwin. Carolus Linnaeus was a Christian creationist, pre-Darwinian scientist who lived in a time when species were thought to be immutable, requiring a supernatural creation. So he was quite surprised when he pioneered the systematic classification of life and discovered that organisms do not fit into separate boxes of created kinds. There's no such thing as a kind. What he discovered instead was multiple levels of sibling groups descending from parental sets in a branching tree pattern, a family tree of life. And creationism could not explain this. So he challenged the scientific community of his day to produce a generic character to distinguish humans and apes. No one could, because humans are apes in the same sense that lions are cats and iguanas are lizards and ducks are birds. So when Darwin discovered that species could evolve, new species could evolve that didn't interbreed with their ancestral or sister stock anymore, he recognized the first of a few working mechanisms of population mechanics amid environmental dynamics, which made sense of Carolus Linnaeus' otherwise inexplicable tree of life. Now, creationism is an assertion, an unsupported assertion, of impossible absurdities, literally a fantasy that is defensible only with the frauds, falsehoods, and fallacies of faith. But evolution is a reality that is objectively verified with a continuously improving understanding, regardless what some may prefer to believe. I'm done.
James?
All right. Well, thank you to Cornerstone for putting this on, and thank you to Mr. Ra for joining me up here. I have a lot of respect for Mr. Ra. I know he's a hard worker. He's involved in a lot of different projects, and I appreciate that he doesn't ignore big questions like this question. And as I understand it, you like Mystery Science Theater 3000, which is pretty much my favorite show ever, so I have a lot of respect for you in that regard, too. So, okay, back to the question. I think what Mr. Ra needs to show us, if he's going to show us that this is indeed a verified fact, as he says, then he needs to show us two things. Number one, he needs to show us that Darwinism can happen. By that I mean that it's possible that there's a mechanism by which a single-celled organism can change over time into all the different organisms on Earth today, including plants and even humans, and that this mechanism is capable of building things like eyes and wings and organs and so on. And it's not just enough to show, though, that it's possible. A lot of things are possible. We also need to see historical evidence that it did happen in the past. So presumably that would be something like the fossil record. Now, regarding the mechanism that Darwinists typically point to is mutation plus selection, typically natural selection. But you see, this is going to be a problem because the biologist and Darwinist, Dr. Darrell Falk, recently admitted that many Darwinian scientists agree that the entire mechanism of Darwinian evolution needs major rethinking. And the reason for this is pretty obvious. When we observe mutations, we don't observe them adding new information toward building new structures. Instead, the vast majority of mutations that we observe either do nothing, they're neutral, or they actually damage existing structures. They damage things like eyes and wings and organs and so on. And that's why the famed biologist, and she was a Darwinist, Dr. Lynn Margulis, was very clear during her career that mutations are inadequate to explain where all the new information for new structures comes from. And so I think this casts serious doubt on the mechanism of Darwinian evolution. But regarding the historical record, we would look, of course, to the fossil record. And Darwin said that his theory predicted that we would find countless transitional fossils. Now, and it makes sense. I mean, think about it. If every organism on Earth today and the extinct organisms, which there are even more of those, are all related through a family tree, then we ought to find countless transitional fossils. Now, certainly there are many alleged transitional fossils that Darwinists typically point to, and I'm sure Mr. Ra will be happy to list many of them here for us today. But the fact is, you need to investigate those. Listen to the transitional fossils that he lists. Go ahead and write them down. He may list Tiktaalik or Archaeopteryx or Amblyocetus or Australopithecus or many others. Write them down, investigate them, because I think when you investigate them, many of these actually turn out not to be legitimate transitions. But the point is, even if those turn out to be legitimate transitions, it's still far short of what the theory predicts. So now regarding the taxonomy is a great system of classification, but we can take the cars out here on the road and we can put them in a classification system. It doesn't mean they're related.
Second question. How do you account for other religions' claims of miracles, change lives, healing, or personal relationships with their versions of God or other gods, like the Lord Krishna, for example?
All right. So if other religions claim to have experienced things like miracles or a personal relationship with God, those are truth claims, just like if a Christian claims those sorts of things. So we should do our best to investigate those truth claims. So if someone claims to have experienced a miracle or a healing, well, whether it's a Christian or a non-Christian, still we should see, are there multiple witnesses? Are some of these witnesses unbiased, meaning that they weren't expecting a miracle, yet they can't deny that they experienced this miracle? Is there scientific documentation, something like medical records? And that's exactly the kind of evidence that Lee Strobel provides in his latest book, The Case for Miracles. He includes many well-documented examples of miracles with this kind of evidence. Now, if that book isn't enough, with its dozen or so cases of miracles, well, then you could look to Dr. Craig Keener's 2-volume, 1,100-page work documenting hundreds of examples of miracles, including healings. And many of these, he provides documentation of multiple witnesses, including unbiased witnesses, ones who weren't expecting a miracle, and he also provides scientific documentation for many of those miracles. Now, if you have one person who claims to have experienced a miracle, and there are no other witnesses, well, it may still be true, but there's no way for you to verify that. It's going to be much harder to investigate. Now, as far as changed lives or personal relationship with God, this is much more subjective, and it's going to be harder to investigate. Yes, lives are changed by following Jesus, but that's really not the best reason to become a Christian. Lives are changed by following Mormonism, and changed by following Islam and Buddhism. In fact, lives are changed simply by adopting the practice of meditation, or even reading a self-help book. So just because someone's life has been changed, it doesn't tell you necessarily whether that's true. So if someone claims to have a personal relationship with God, well, me on the outside, that's not really something I can investigate about them. Maybe it's something they can know to some degree, and maybe there are some signs I can look for, but really it's kind of out of my realm to investigate. Instead, I'd rather focus on the scientific evidence, the historical evidence, and the logical evidence that we can investigate. Now, notice this is one of Mr. Ra's questions and about subjective experience. And my concern is, unfortunately, this question is distracting us from the real issue of investigating the truth claims of Darwinism. So I think we need to focus on, first of all, do we have evidence, do we have convincing evidence that Darwinism can happen, that there's a mechanism by which a single-celled organism can change into all the organisms on Earth today, including humans? And also, do we have historical evidence? What in the fossil record gives us confidence that indeed everything on Earth, including the extinct organisms, are all related through a family tree? And so I think that's what we need to investigate in order to know whether this is actually true. So that's what I'd rather focus on.
How would I answer the same question? Okay, well, I appreciate that you stated that people can change their lives by the adoption of a hobby or by changing their interests. But it's especially powerful when you imagine that you've got communication with some deity you don't have to produce any evidence for, whether it's a deity or whether it's the spirits of your ancestors talking to you, or whether it's ghosts or whether it's reptiles from another star system that are communicating through your tinfoil hat, whatever it is. It gives you more power to know that you're part of some secret cadre of private knowledge and that you have the ear of the most powerful being in the world. And how great would that be when you have somebody that can make 2 + 2 = 5 on the odd occasion that it needs to be happening? So the reason that people have all of these experiences is because it's easy to psych oneself up to experience it. I did not go directly from Christian to atheist as so many of my friends did. I went through a neo-pagan stage, which is probably obvious just looking at me. And I discovered the exact same thing happens. We can read auras, we can chant mantras and convince ourselves of all kinds of things because you're psyching yourself up. I've realized that I can create an illusion for people, whatever they already want to believe in, as long as I've got the ambiance to set for that. Whether it's drums or firelight or incense or whatever, chanting or music, sitar music in some cases if they're Hindu, but it will just encourage that belief. It won't change their belief. It doesn't change their mind. It's whatever they already want to adopt. And you will see auras, and you will transform out of your body, and you will have more direct experience of the paranormal and supernatural through neo-pagan practices and transcendental meditation and that sort of thing than you get from most churches, even with the speaking in tongues and all of that. It's just a way that people delude themselves and generate a sense of self-sufficient comfort. And we'll get to my problems with that later on. I reserve the rest of my time.
Third question. What are the differences between the claims of biblical creation scientists and intelligent design scientists?
For me? Okay. There really isn't much of a difference except that intelligent design creationists don't want you to know that they're creationists. So they try to stay away from the biblical references. Not always. There's sometimes there's leaders in the group that say that they can only be talking about a God and they only hypothetically bring up what other, maybe aliens or something like that. They're really talking about a God. And most of them are doing this because of a commitment to Scripture, which is what creationism is. Creationism is specifically, it's a rejection of evolution. But more importantly, and this is a bigger issue, and this was revealed by, I can't remember his name now, so it doesn't matter, that creationism is a rejection of methodological naturalism, the scientific method, where every postulation has to be based on evidence, that you already have to have evidence to indicate that what you're saying is correct, and there has to be an objective way to verify it, to find out which areas of it are false and which direction would be the correction. This is the scientific method, but a number of these people have advocated that they want to chip away at that empirical evidence, and they want to use supernatural explanations as though they were scientific. And this is what they want to teach in school. They want to be able to teach their own religious beliefs that miracles can be a scientific explanation, and so they don't have to know about evolution or anything else that we can verify to be true.
Okay, so now Mr. Ra has said that there isn't really much of a difference between intelligent design scientists and biblical creation scientists. Of course, there are similarities. That's true. In both camps, you'll find geneticists, you'll find developmental biologists, microbiologists, biochemists, paleontologists, botanists, and so on. But it turns out that the claims of biblical creation scientists are very different than the claims of intelligent design scientists. You see, biblical creation scientists claim that the scientific evidence supports the biblical creation account. That includes things like Adam and Eve, details like the idea that God created these different kinds, and even sometimes scientific evidence for Noah's flood. But intelligent design scientists don't defend those biblical claims. Instead, they make a much more basic claim. Their claim is that when we use certain scientific tools, there are certain scientific tools that demonstrate that life is the result of an intelligent designer. Now, who that intelligent designer is, the intelligent design scientists say, well, you're going to have to use different scientific, philosophical, and historical tools to investigate that. But their claim is that when we use the science of design detection, basically forensic science tools, we can discover that life is the result of an intelligent designer. Now, that's why when you look at intelligent design scientists, you see scientists from many different backgrounds, many different religions, and even some who are non-religious, and even some who are agnostic. They haven't even decided whether God exists, yet they still see that the scientific evidence shows that life is the result of some kind of intelligent designer. You certainly won't see that with biblical creation scientists, right? You won't find a biblical creation scientist who says, I'm not sure if God exists, or, I'm non-religious, that kind of thing. And that's because the main source of authority is the difference. In the arguments of biblical creation scientists, they use the Bible as an authority in their arguments. But intelligent design scientists don't use the Bible or any other religious texts as a source of authority in arguing for intelligent design. Now, before we can ask which biblical account of design is true, like, does the evidence support a biblical account of design, we first need to ask the much more simple question, is life the result of design at all? And really, if you're going to adjudicate between Mr. Ra's view and my view, that's the first question you need to ask, because the main difference between us is I think that the scientific evidence shows that life is the result of design. So the best thing you can do is read both sides. Read the evidence from the Darwinian scientists, and then read the evidence from the intelligent design scientists, and read the response by the Darwinian scientists, and read the response by the intelligent design scientists. That way you can weigh both sides. Now, when someone says that there isn't much of a difference between intelligent design science and biblical creation science, it shows me that they're not very familiar with the books, the articles, and the lectures of intelligent design scientists, because they go out of their way in just about everything they produce to go on about the many differences between the claims of biblical creation scientists and intelligent design scientists. So I implore you to investigate it for yourself and see if what I'm saying is true, that there is that significant difference between the claims of biblical creation scientists and intelligent design scientists.
Next question. Why have you invested the last 20 years of your life to arguing against something you don't even believe in?
Well, obviously, it's because of something that I do believe in, right? I believe in truth. The truth is what the facts are, what we can show to be true. And to my experience of 20 years of arguing with creationism, I've determined that it is not possible to defend creationism honestly. There has to be some misdirection thrown in there. For example, the difference between creationists and intelligent design theorists. There was a book called Pandas and People that was originally about creationism, and it gave the definition of creationism, and they were teaching this textbook in school. But then there was a law passed where you cannot teach creationism in school, so the authors did a macro change so that the definition of creationism suddenly became intelligent design, and creationists was changed to intelligent design theorists. The definition is exactly the same. Therefore, the argument, the whole thing, is exactly the same. Intelligent design is definitely creationism, and they proved this in a court of law. Another thing that's misrepresented, I will talk about evolution, and he will only say Darwinism. And then when he talks about Darwinism, it's not the evolution that I'm talking about. He's talking about the origin of life. So there's equivocation, and there's misdirection. And then we have the whole issue about whether there is a God or not, right? So that's what it always has to come down to. And that's what I said about methodological naturalism. They want to believe in this the supernatural being, and so they go to a logical fallacy called the God of the gaps, which is the idea that if science can't explain it, therefore God, which of course is not the case. That's also, God of the gaps is two. It's the fallacy of incredulity and also the fallacy of false dichotomy, because if not this, then this, they don't consider any other options. What science can't explain, we get to pretend to explain. So it's unexplained, therefore it's explained. It doesn't work that way.
All right. Well, let's see here. Now, the question says 20 years. Why have you devoted the last 20 years? Well, if that's on some website, I'm not sure if that was mainly for the 20 years that you've spent on this. If that's on some website or something, I need to get that fixed, because I've really only spent the last 10 years doing presentations about the evidence against Darwinism. 20 years ago, what I was doing is I started to think maybe belief in God was actually maybe just a myth. And so I started researching different religions, and I started researching atheism, and I started researching different scientific theories, including Darwinism. And I thought that maybe I would find that the evidence was against belief in God, and that the claims of Christianity were poorly supported. What it turned out, as I investigated this, is that the evidence for the existence of God and the claims of Christianity is overwhelming. And I found that the scientific evidence for intelligent design is incredible. And yet, when I investigated Darwinism, I found that the scientific evidence is severely lacking for this theory. But I was still open to Darwinism. I thought, well, maybe it still could be true. I mean, I had just done an initial investigation. So I continued to investigate Darwinism for the next 10 years. Over the next 10 years, I started to read both sides. I read Darwinist scientists, and I read intelligent design scientists, and even some biblical creation scientists to weigh their arguments. And it was only then, after 10 years of researching it, that finally I decided, yeah, the evidence for Darwinism, I was finally confident that Darwinism is indeed false. And so that's when I started presenting the scientific problems with Darwinism. Now, the question asks, well, why would you do presentations like this? Well, I'll tell you why, because people need to know that the dominant theory is riddled with scientific problems. And that's why it's because of that investigation that I say that when we look to Darwinism, we need to see, number one, that it can happen, that it's possible, that there's a mechanism that can actually create things like eyes and wings and organs and so on. And then also we need to see the historical evidence. We need to see evidence in history, basically the fossil record, presumably, that all organisms are connected through this sort of family tree. Now, Mr. Raw had mentioned that, that I talk about Darwinism, I call it Darwinism, and that's something that creationists do. Well, actually, that's not true. That's something that, actually, as I read the scientific literature, that's something that Darwinists do. Darwinists call their own theory Darwinism. Not every one of them, but many of them. People like Eva Jablonka, people like the eminent paleontologist Niles Eldridge, Ernst Mayr, who's very prominent, Stephen Jay Gould, Bruce Weber, even Asa Gray back in the 1800s, and so on. Even Richard Dawkins calls it Darwinism. Now, the other thing that he mentioned is Of Pandas and People. Well, if it turns out that that book was indeed a creationist book and they changed the language to intelligent design, does that prove that intelligent design is creationism? No, it proves that that one book was a creationist book, so it only applies to that book. But as it turns out, if you look into it, they use the word creation because they didn't have another word, and they later discovered intelligent design is the best word for their view.
Can the process of Darwinian evolution be observed occurring? Can the process of Darwinian evolution be observed occurring, Aaron?
Yes. As I said, macroevolution, speciation, has been directly observed and documented both in the lab and in naturally controlled conditions in the field dozens of times. That's macroevolution. Microevolution is, as I said, the exact same mechanisms. These are population genetics. These, natural selection doesn't have to account for a lot. He mentioned Lynn Margulis, for example, who said that Darwinian selection was, where he put Darwinian, that was insufficient to explain everything. She was talking about endosymbiosis. Why it is that all of our cells encompass a bacterial cell. Your mitochondria is a form of Rickettsia bacteria that was disabled by a mutation and then captured by the larger eukaryote cell. So you get your energy by a symbiotic relationship where originally the first eukaryote cells swallowed Rickettsia bacteria and became where they start replicating at the same time and helping each other out. And that's how we started out. This endosymbiosis was something that was well outside of the Darwinian mechanism. That's not population genetics. That's not descent with inherent genetic modification. When you're talking about evolution, and you're talking about origin of life, you have to have genetics to descend from. So origin of life is another set of completely different processes. Not Darwinism. Darwinism is meant to imply that we are somehow just another religious belief. Today, currently, we have a handful of elderly professors in Europe that still use that term, but that's about it. Traditionally, Darwinism was a means of countering Lamarckism. This other guy earlier named Lamarck came up with this other evolutionary theory that didn't work. His was replaced by the one that does work. It's just evolution, and people called it Darwinism when it was just the Darwinian mechanisms of natural and sexual selection. We've since added a whole lot more mechanisms, and then it changed names a couple more times, and now it is the extended evolutionary synthesis, and is not Darwinism in any form at all.
All right, my turn. All right, so Can it be observed occurring? Well, I don't think we see Darwinism observed in the lab or in nature. And that's why the biologist, and he's a Darwinist, Dr. James Shapiro, recently admitted that Darwinism is lacking in observational experiments that show how new traits and new structures arise. And again, it's because when we observe mutations, we don't observe them adding new information toward building new structures. Instead, the vast majority of mutations that we observe are either neutral or they're actually damaging existing structures. The few beneficial mutations that we observe are not building new structures. And the best place you can look to find evidence of Darwinism in action would be to look to the lab of Richard Lenski, who's a biologist and he's a Darwinist. For the last 30 years, he's been breeding E. coli in his lab. Now, E. coli regenerate every 20 minutes. And so in the last 30 years, he's generated over 60,000 generations of E. coli, which is equivalent to more than 1 million years worth of human evolution. So in that time, we ought to see some pretty significant changes. Well, what he observes in the mutations that he finds is that they consistently shut down complex structures. For example, one of the most consistent results that he's gotten is these mutations shut down the bacterial flagellum. Now, the flagellum is like an outboard motor that bacteria use. It's that long whip-like tail that bacteria use to swim through a liquid. And it turns out that that's one of the most common results that he gets is that mutation shuts down the bacterial flagellum. Now, the best result that he's gotten is that he found a mutation that actually allows the bacteria to metabolize or digest citrate, which it wasn't able to do at the beginning of the experiment 30 years ago. But as he investigated the genes that were responsible, what he found out is that it turns out that bacteria in the past was able to metabolize citrate. It had that ability before. There was an entire system that in the past was shut down, probably through a mutation. And so the mutation that he observed was actually just a simple mutation switching on a pre-existing system. And so this is not innovation. And that's why Richard Lenski, Dr. Lenski, and the other scientists that work with him have been very clear over and over again that when they observe mutations, they observe far more damaging mutations than any beneficial mutations. The damaging ones build up much faster than any beneficial ones, even with natural selection. They apply heavy selective pressure to try to select out the damaging mutations. They're not selecting them out fast enough. And so that's why the Cornell geneticist, Dr. John Sanford, wrote an entire book providing a mountain of evidence that damaging mutations accumulate much faster than beneficial ones ever can, even with natural selection. Now, someone might say, well, with intelligent design, do you ever observe intelligent design? You weren't there for the original creation event. What we do observe is information coming into existence. And our uniform, repeated experience, complex specified information always comes from a mind. Well, even the most simple single cell, that first cell, would have to be full of hundreds, actually thousands of characters of information. And so the best explanation for even the most simple single cell is that you would have to have an intelligent designer to explain the information in the cell.
Final question. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 22, God says he had to get Adam out of the garden before he ate from the tree of eternal life, because then the man could live forever. So that would have happened to Adam over the next 1,000 years or so if he never ate from either tree.
Is that me? Me, okay. All right, so the question is, what if Adam had never eaten from either tree? Well, this is a what-if question, and I found that what-if questions are usually a waste of time, because we can always make up another what-if question. I mean, what if Adam fell off a cliff before he ate from either tree? What if God created Adam but not Eve? What would happen to the human race? What if Jesus moved to Tahiti before he had a chance to be crucified? That kind of thing. I mean, these are fun questions, but it doesn't... I'm much more interested in looking at the evidence for what did happen. I want to know what did happen in history. Now, and I think what we've seen so far is that we still don't have that evidence that there's a mechanism by which Darwinism can happen, and we don't see the historical evidence that Darwinism did happen. Now, because I've read Mr. Ra's book, I do know that what he's implying here on page 94 is that there's a problem in the Genesis text. He's saying, would Adam have really lived forever if he never ate from either tree, especially if he never ate food or never ate from the tree of life? Well, the answer to that is, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe he would have died. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with saying Adam was probably responsible for feeding himself and taking care of himself, that kind of thing. But rather than speculate about what could have happened or what would have happened, I'd really rather look at the scientific evidence for what did happen. And I want you to notice that this is another one of Mr. Ra's questions. And I just want to point out that all the questions that he asked are questions about religion, about religious texts and about religion, and all the questions I wrote are about science and looking at the scientific evidence. And it's not to say that I'm only about science, he's only about religion, that sort of thing, but I just don't want anyone to let you I don't want you to let anyone tell you that creationists only appeal to the Bible and Darwinists only appeal to science. I don't think that's what you've seen here today. Now, I do want to mention a couple things. Mr. Raw had mentioned that macroevolution is speciation. Well, I think that's a very dangerous definition of macroevolution, and I have here several prominent Darwinists who do not define macroevolution as simple speciation. Instead, macroevolution is evolutionary patterns that are expressed over millions or hundreds of millions of years. Well, if they're expressed over millions or hundreds of millions of years, then they're not observational. You can't observe it. Now, he mentioned that Lynn Margulis, that her observations about natural selection don't really apply or have already been integrated. And that wasn't what I was bringing up. I was bringing up her observations about mutations, that they aren't the source of this novelty. And he mentioned eukaryotic theory. That's a very interesting theory about how eukaryotes came to be, but that's a theory. That is not a proven fact, because you need historical evidence to show that that did happen in history. Now, you mentioned origin of life. I didn't even bring up origin of life until just now. I brought up the idea of information. And that's the first time, and I didn't ask Mr. Raw to give evidence for the origin of life. The fact of the matter is that the scientific evidence for naturalistic origin of life, a Darwinian origin of life, is severely lacking.
So my answer to that is that there are certain contradictions in the Bible that they have to come up with new interpretations in order to try to gloss those over. One of them being that it's interesting to me that serpent is often referred to as the Lord of Lies, even though he's the only one in that story, and it wasn't even described as being Satan, but people just assume it's another interpretation. The Bible doesn't say that the serpent was Satan at all. But that character, the serpent, was the only one who told the truth throughout. So how do you rectify that? How is it that God said, in that day you will die? What are you going to do now? Well, then they have to pretend that Adam was immortal and that he brought death into the world when he ate the fruit. Well, if that's the case, then why is there a fruit of eternal life? What would be the point of that? He dodged that pretty expertly, but then he brought up evidence. And we have a problem with this because he talks about the evidence for Christianity and evidence for creation and so forth. Evidence is a body of objectively verifiable facts which are positively indicative of or exclusively concordant with one conclusion over any other. We don't have that for an intelligent designer. There has never been any objectively verifiable evidence that actually indicates an intelligent designer. None. He said he read my entire book and he's still repeating things that were corrected in that book, and I'm very confused about that, right up to and including the constant use of the word Darwinism when it's already been explained why that's inappropriate in this age and in this country.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our first discussion in Moment of Truth. I would like to thank both gentlemen who came to speak today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your willingness, your passion on both topics. Thank you very much.